Okay, good morning and maybe good afternoon if you're in other parts of the world. My name is Alex Gray. I'm the head of Trade and Transaction Banking at LIBF. We're just participants just joining, so please we'll wait a couple of minutes for those people. And please feel free to use the chat box. Tell us where you're coming from. I've seen on the registration list some of my old alumni from HSBC and Santander are going to join, and I see we've got Dave Meynell with us. He used to be at Deutsche Bank, so maybe some his former colleagues are joining. And as I'm Scottish, I'm curious if anybody's coming in from Scotland. There's somebody from Slovenia, Indonesia. Indonesia, Dave is going to get upset because he was meant to be in Bali on holiday, so yeah, that's probably making him feel not so good, to be honest. Well, hello to Indonesia. Yeah, and Kent, somebody from Kent, an English person, so good to have a bit of diversity, Dave, eh?
Indeed.
This is the third of our webinars. We've very much an international group, so the numbers are coming up. We've got South Africa, Sri Lanka, and got people inviting you back over after the coronavirus is gone, Dave, so don't worry, you'll be made to feel welcome another time.
Good to hear.
While we're waiting for people to join, maybe, Rox, we can put the first poll up just to see where what parts of the world people are joining us from. Just to test, this is to people from Turkey, Myanmar. So we just want to know more about what continent you're joining us from. I think we've covered them all there. If you're joining from the Americas, of course, it's a very early morning, but we did have one person join. Maybe they have sleep problems. Okay, so we've already got over 100 people joining, so that's great. We're back on Adobe Connect this week. We used Zoom last week as the person who was speaking didn't have access to Adobe, but functionality is better, I think, with the chat function. Somebody from Australia, so we have got some. Yeah, that'll be somebody from Australia. There's probably two people in Oceania. Okay, so yeah, we've got most predominantly Europe, but large proportion from Asia who are well into their working day. So thanks for that, Paul Rox. This is an idea, and then we're just interested in the kind of roles that you're in. So if we can put that next poll up, please, Rox, so that Dave gets an idea of the roles that we're in. We're just a kind of broad idea. So are you in operations, sales, product, or maybe another role? Maybe you're well, the operations people are quick off that they were the ones that hit the button first, So yeah, so about half the people from operations, which is interesting because we're looking at international trade. What people that do that qualification come from the sales and product side. Okay, thanks, Rox. I think in the interest of time, we'll get underway. So as I said, thanks so much for joining. You also, if you're wanting CPD points, to be able to get one CPD point for attending this webinar, or if you're watching the video. But today we're looking at the core principles of international trade finance. We're joined today by Dave Meynell, who's the founder of the Trade LC Advisory, an advisory and consultancy service, and the co-owner of the TradeFinance.training, an online platform for training of trade finance. As I mentioned, Dave's worked 30 years at Deutsche Bank, and importantly for us, in terms of getting the right person to speak, he is the chief examiner of the Certificate of International Trade Finance, CITF, and he's also senior technical advisor for the ICC Banking Commission. So an illustrious background, we want to get the right speakers on. So this is being recorded, and we'll have a Q&A at the end, so please feel free to use the chat box, but if your question isn't answered, we'll still we'll still address the questions at a later date and pass them out to you. So Dave, over to you. Thank you very much. I'm going to turn my camera off, and we'll see you later.
Thank you very much, Alex. And good morning, good afternoon to everybody. To begin with, I'm just going to concentrate on a high level on 4 of the earlier modules within the CITF course. And those of you that have seen the outline of the course are probably aware of this: the international trade environment, counterparties and contracts, essential trade documentation, which has become a particularly important issue over the last 3 months, and methods of settlement and the risk ladder. I started with the international trade environment. Now, we all know, and again, looking over the last 3 months, we're seeing even more of these. There are many risks that entities face in international trade, and that all of you, whether you're in sales, operations, product, or whatever, need to be aware of. These range from country risks, which probably include political, language, cultural, technology, environmental, economic, transfer, and many more. Commercial risks, the 2 obvious ones: non-payment from the buyer and non-delivery by the seller. Transportation risks with potentially increased transit times. FX and interest rate fluctuations. Legal risks are always there: IP, technology, courts, local law, injunction, even acceptance of ICC rules. Financial crime. There is a specific module within the CITF course of financial crime. We won't touch on it today, but I can assure you it's a very interesting module to look at and very important to your work. Administrative risks, which could include documentation. This I will touch on again later. Price fluctuations in commodities and manufacturing risks. And this is just touching the surface. There are many, many more on that. Now, how do you help alleviate these risks? Well, number one way of doing this is thorough research. It helps you identify what the risks are and helps you identify different risk mitigants to find solutions. I guess the key words here, in other words, you're not alone. If you as a bank, you as a corporate, a logistic company go into international trade, there's lots of sources of help out there. And these include government departments. Certainly in the UK, I know, and in many other countries, there are distinct teams that can assist in providing information and advice for companies that trade globally. I thoroughly recommend that you locate these in your own country. Chambers of Commerce, which you're all aware of, I'm sure. They work with local businesses to promote and share opportunities. Trade missions, trade exhibitions, and trade shows. These are overseas business trips. At the moment, there's not many of those going on, probably none at all. But in normal environments, there are plenty of them. And of course, as most of you know, banks. Most banks have dedicated trade finance areas. These can provide help and assistance on many issues. They include reports on economic situations, contact names of overseas businesses, access to banks' own correspondent networks, and advice on products and solutions. One, of course, very important thing is when a buyer and seller get together, it's quite possible that the overseas entity may be unknown to the domestic company. And based on this, status inquiries and credit references can be obtained from various sources that can provide information in respect of the counterparty. And that's normally based on historical trading data. And the parties you can approach, again, the banks, obviously. The bank of the counterparty may be able to respond to a status inquiry. Credit reference agencies, which can be found in most countries and regions, can provide credit references on specific companies. Credit rating agencies, you'll be aware of the 3 main ones, which are Moody's, Standard & Poor's, and Fitch. And credit insurers. Whilst you may think these companies just provide credit insurance, they also can make available credit reports. And once you have identified a business opportunity, what can you do? There's various routes. I'll very quickly just say 4 of them. When you enter an overseas market for the first time, you can go direct to the end users of the goods, known as direct exporting. You can go indirectly by an agent or a distributor. You can establish a joint venture, or you can do licensing and franchising. And all of these are covered in far more detail within the training course itself. So that's very briefly an introduction to the international trade environment itself. Let's move on to parties and contracts. Now, the diagram you can see there just shows a small proportion of the many hundreds, if not thousands, of business types that can be involved in a trade transaction. And when you enter into a new business with a new counterparty, there are various safeguards that should be considered. I've already touched on the checking creditworthiness, with an appropriate credit agency. Going back to what I said earlier again, obtaining references and the track record of companies. Obtaining status reports from the bankers of the counterparties. Very importantly, reviewing published accounts. Also look for warning signs. There are various red flags that can be raised, and you'll see a lot more of this in detail in the financial crime module. But things such as facilitation fees, which could potentially infer bribery. Lack of response to basic questions that are being asked. You should always get a clear answer, have transparency. No business logos or use of a personal email address rather than a business email. You'll be surprised how often this happens. Inappropriate addresses as well. There's all sorts of warning signs that can be up. But also be aware of sanctions that may apply in different regions or territories. And again, there's a specific module on sanctions. You'll be able to read about that when you take the course. But the ICC, the International Chamber of Commerce, also recently released a paper on sanctions and how you should handle them as a banker. External factors that can affect international trade. The textbook uses one particular model to help you with this, and it's called PESTLE, P-E-S-T-L-E. This stands for the P is political. How and to what degree a government intervenes in the economy. E, economic. Look at economic growth, interest rates, exchange rates, inflation, disposable income, employment levels, all sorts of things. The S is for social. Look at population growth, age distribution, health, career attitudes, relationships, culture, languages. Again, many different aspects there. The T is for technological. And there you should be looking at the speed of change and impact of technology in various countries. Look at copyrights. Look at intellectual property rights and look at safety standards. L, legal. Look at health and safety, equal opportunities, consumer rights, labelling, patents, employment law. Again, very wide gamut of different issues. And the final one, E, is environmental. Ethics, carbon footprints, sustainability, which is a very big issue these days for all companies, including banks, climate change policy, child labour, etc., etc. I know these 6 issues should be considered in isolation. When you're looking at going into the international trade market and an overseas market, every single one of these should be considered very carefully. Then the third bullet point there on the screen, parties. Well, I'm only going to talk about a few because we could spend the whole day describing the roles of different parties. First of all, I'm going to talk about is freight forwarders, the people that carry the goods. These are normally appointed by the buyer or the seller. The idea is to procure the various contracts required for the transportation of the goods. And the freight forwarder will book space on the relevant mode of transport, which could be air, sea, road or rail. These days, most is done by air and sea, but you'd be surprised how much is still done by road and rail. The freight forwarder also arranges collection of goods from the seller's premises for delivery to the carrier, and may also coordinate delivery on the other side to the overseas buyer. Freight forwarders also can be involved in parceling and loading of the goods, operating the transport, doing the warehousing, and managing customs requirements. It all depends how much companies are prepared to pay for. Another important party in trade is the cargo insurers. They will arrange transport insurance for specific shipments or as a whole or on an ad hoc basis. It is critical when you're looking at insurance to know which of the parties to the contract of sale will bear the insurance risk and the scope of such risk, because it does vary widely, again depending on the risk that you're prepared to pay for. Statistically, the most common causes of loss or damage appear to occur through theft, pilferage, exposure to water or condensation, breakage or contamination. Then the final party I'm going to mention, the banks, where I guess many of you work already. And as you know, the services provided by banks are quite wide-ranging and can help to facilitate a trade transaction from start to finish. These services can include advisory and consultancy, contract preparations and negotiations, drafting of contracts even, provision of trade security instruments such as documentary credits, collections, guarantees, etc., etc. They can help with documentation and what's needed in various markets, help you to mitigate foreign currency risk, handle payment and settlements, probably one of the most important parts, and the provision of finance. Now, this particular module on parties and contracts explains these and many more details in greater detail. So once you get into this module, you'll see a lot more. I just wanted to mention one more key party, bearing in mind that I do a lot of work with them and that most of my history in trade finance has involved working with this company in various ways, and that's the ICC, the International Chamber of Commerce. All of you, I'm sure, are aware of this company because they draft and produce many of the prime rules and standards that support global trade. The one you're probably most aware of being the UCP, the Uniform Customs and Practice for Documentary Credits. The current version is UCP 600, and they are probably the most successful private set of trade rules anywhere that's ever been created. We also have the Uniform Rules for Demand Guarantees, Uniform Rules for Collections, and moving forward, we have the electronic rules now. The UCP and the URC have moved into the electronic world. And currently, more rules are being worked on regarding digital trade transactions. The ICC also gets involved in the arbitration of disputes. They have an arbitration court. They also have a system called DocDex, which is documentary disputes for traditional trade instruments that any party can send in their inquiry. They also advocate policy and work very, very closely with regulators and governmental bodies in order to ensure that everybody's in the same standards around the world. And the final bullet point on that slide, contract considerations. Now, as I'm sure most of you are aware, the exact definitions of a contract may differ depending on the country, the region, the territory, even on the type of goods, services or performances are provided or covered. In essence, a contract is a legally binding agreement between two or more persons or entities. It obliges each to fulfill a promise against a consideration. And it's important to consider which law and jurisdiction would be applicable against each specific contract. Should it all go wrong, in most cases don't, but if it does, you do need to know which law and which jurisdiction you need to fall back upon. Now, a number of elements, depending on the choice of law and jurisdiction, are likely to be applicable when negotiating a contract. And these include a firm offer, an acceptance of offer, a capacity to contract, i.e. the entity legally allowed to contract, the intention to create a contract, free consent, in other words, no one's coerced them into doing this, consideration, in other words, each entity will promise to do something in return for a benefit, and ultimately, that there is a legal purpose for the contract. When you look at the contract from order to fulfillment, you have a generic order process, which may or may not include the financing products, such as documentary credits and bills of exchange. It all begins with an inquiry from an overseas buyer, for which the seller determines its ability to fulfill the order. Due diligence is completed by the seller to determine the creditworthiness of the buyer. Due diligence, by the way, is something you will come up frequently throughout the CITF course. It doesn't matter which party you are, this is essential. The next step would be a written quote is sent to the buyer, and if acceptable, the buyer will place an order. The seller should then accept the order, and the order is then processed by the seller. Goods then shipped. Any documents, relevant documents, can be sent directly or indirectly to the buyer. If you're using a documentary credit, for instance, it will be indirectly. And then goods are received and payment is effected. Regarding the contract management, the entire process could actually be very, very lengthy. It can be time consuming, and it can impose on a number of resources and departments and outside parties. Therefore, it's critical, in order to avoid any potential problems, that all departments are in line and have the same objective of fulfillment. The sales, manufacturing, supply department, product development, and accounts departments must be in equal alignment. And very, very importantly, and it probably is the most crucial point, all risks and available risk mitigants must be fully explored and understood. Moving on to another module, essential trade documentation. Now, the reason I mentioned this has suddenly become very important these days is because the delivery of many documents has been curtailed or stopped or held up due to various couriers not being able to deliver documents in certain countries. So it's not the place of this particular webinar to talk about the solutions that have been put in place, but certainly later on during the Q&A, if you want to talk about the issues that have been faced by banks, buyers and sellers with regard to the delivery of documents under this pandemic, I'm quite happy to answer questions on those. Now, the three main types of documents are financial, transport and commercial. The financial includes bills of exchange, for instance. There's a definition that was given in the UK Bills of Exchange Act of 1882, more than almost 140 years ago, which is used on a global basis, to be honest, which says a bill of exchange is an unconditional order in writing, addressed by one person to another, signed by the person giving it, requiring the person to whom it is addressed to pay on demand or at a fixed or determinable future date a sum certain in money to or to the order of a specified person or to bearer. And the order to pay normally originates from a creditor, which is the seller or the exporter, known as the drawer. And the order is addressed to the debtor, which is the buyer or the importer, known as the drawee. And when a draft is required under documentary credit, the drawee will normally be a bank. I don't recommend that you use drafts under documentary credits. There's even a paper from the ICC recommending this. But we certainly still see many drafts in documentary credits around the world, particularly in Asia. That's customs and practice in those areas, so drafts still continue at this stage. Another financial document is a promissory note, also defined in the UK Bills of Exchange Act as an unconditional promise in writing made by one person to another, signed by the maker, engaging to pay on demand or at a fixed or determinable future date a sum certain in money to or to the order of the specified person or to bearer. Now, the difference between a bill of exchange and a promissory note is that a promissory note contains a direct promise of payment by the person who signs it instead of an order to pay, and there's no drawee involved. Moving on to the second types of documents, transport documents. The main one that all of you will be aware of is a bill of lading. That's been designed for marine shipments. It's effective on a port-to-port basis, and I'm certain it's probably the most common form of transport document that's required by a documentary credit. There is a subset of bills of lading, multimodal bills of lading, which are designed for from transport from source to destination, and there may be a transshipment in between. And that's the one that most of you will normally see under documentary credits. It's common for goods to be released against the surrender to the carrier or its agent of one of the original bills of lading that have been issued. And again, that's a problem that's been faced over the last 3 months when bills of lading have been held up for one reason or another and have not got to the destination, which means the goods can be held at the port of unloading, and demurrage charges can accrue. So banks have found different ways to get over this. And again, we can talk about that later if you wish. Another transport document is a non-negotiable seaway bill. Serves primarily as a transport document for use when there is a short sea journey. And the delivery of the goods need not be conditional upon the surrender of an original negotiable transport document, such as the bill of lading, which I just spoke about. There are also charter party bills of lading, which are synonymous with commodity or bulk transshipment cargoes. Behind every charter party bill of lading, there will be a charter party contract that has been agreed between the charterer and the owner of the vessel. There's also air transport documents, which are obviously designed for transport between two named airports. There are road, rail, or inland waterway transport documents. These are three separate and distinct types of transport documents for the road, the rail, and the inland waterway. And also, not so common, but courier receipts, post receipts, and certificates of posting. And these type of documents are usually associated with documentary credits by providing evidence that documents, notices, and the like have been sent to an applicant, an issuing bank, or any other entity by courier or post. And then finally, commercial documents. Obviously, a prime one is the invoice, which primarily identifies the buyer and seller of the goods, services, or performance. The insurance document, which you touched on already. One of the most important documents, to be honest, to be presented under a trade transaction. In the event of loss or damage to the goods, it allows the insured to submit a claim to the insurance company. Certificates of origin, which we see very widely. These attest that goods in a particular shipment are wholly obtained, produced, manufactured or processed in a particular country or countries. There are many other types of commercial documents, including packing lists, weight lists, certificates including analysis, inspection, health, phytosanitary, quantity, quality. The list is almost endless. But as you can see, there's lots and lots of documents you need to be aware of when you're involved in trade, and these are covered in more depth in the course itself. Move on to the next module, which looks at the risk ladder and the methods of settlement. Now you'll see a risk ladder there in the diagram on the screen. It's a very important tool to help buyers and sellers determine the most appropriate form of settlement, depending upon the client relationship, the location of the parties, the goods or services that may be involved, the movement of funds and documents, and the options for settlement and financing. It's important to note that as relationships evolve between most parties, more relaxed terms of settlement may be agreed. To begin with, you want the safest. Once you get to know each other, you can bring it down a notch or two. And as you'll see on the screen, in order of preference for the seller, and the opposite applies for the buyer. The seller prefers payment in advance, quite obviously. Then a documentary credit, then a documentary collection, then open account. As I said, it's opposite for the buyer. A buyer would far prefer open account, obviously. Now, talking about open account, it's estimated that over 80% of world trade is covered by open account. That's an enormous amount. It's normally utilised when each party is well known to each other and trusted. And the idea is that a seller sends its goods to the buyer, together with an invoice including payment terms, and the seller will then pay. And the buyer will then pay. Now, obviously, the seller places a great deal of trust on the buyer to pay. He sends his goods out, he sends the documents out, he's open. So the buyer and seller need to know each other very, very well if you want to use open account. Then we move on to documentary collections. Now, if you look at the ICC Uniform Rules for Collections, latest publication known as URC 522, the collection means the handing by banks of documents as defined in sub-article 2b in accordance with instructions received in order to obtain payment. Further information regarding documentary collections is in a specific module within the CITF training course. Then we move to documentary credits. Again, covered by a set of ICC rules. I've mentioned this earlier, the Uniform Customs and Practice for Documentary Credits. The latest one is known as UCP 600, which came into force in 2007. This means any arrangement, however named or described, that is irrevocable and thereby constitutes a definite undertaking of an issuing bank to honour a compliant presentation. And once again, there is a specific module surrounding documentary credits within the CITF training. And the final one of that slide, payment in advance. Quite clear, it's implied by the title, the buyer pays the seller in advance of any shipment of the goods. And once the seller receives the funds, it's expected that it will arrange for goods to be manufactured or to be shipped. So that very quickly covers the 4 modules I wanted to speak about, very early on modules within the training course. Now, as for the CITF qualification itself, it's now 11 years old. It was launched in 2009. It received the endorsement of the International Chamber of Commerce in 2014 and was revised last year. We received lots of feedback over the last few years over the content of the qualification, and it was quite clear that it needed to be brought more up to date. It had been around for 10 years. Now, whilst much in international trade doesn't change, and the 4 modules I've just spoken about are examples of that, many things do change. And we'll touch on them a little bit later. One, of course, is financial crime compliance, and one is, very importantly, digitalization, which is completely transforming the world we're in. So we updated and revised this qualification in the textbook last year to take account of some of these issues. It covers the basics of international trade and finance. It looks at the processes involved in each type of international trade product, and it looks at the risks involved and, very importantly, how to mitigate them. It covers current banking practices and conventions that are applicable to international trade, and it looks at the roles and responsibilities of all the parties involved in international trade. So you can see the qualification is quite wide ranging. It's not like CDCS, which looks at just one product, or CSDG, which looks at just the guarantees. This covers all products, all types of international trade and finance. If we go on to the next slide, you will see the outline of the course itself. These are the different topics covered by the banks, by the textbook and the course. It starts with setting the scene. What is international trade? Why do companies use international trade? Moves on to the environment, the parties to the contracts, which I've just spoken about. Then a very, very key section of the training is trade-based financial crime compliance. Whether we like it or not, financial crime always exists, always will exist. Even in digitalized world where we try to make it a lot harder, it's still there. This particular topic probably received the most update last year, apart from digitalization, because so many things have happened in the last few years to help buyers, sellers, banks and other parties involved in trade. So that's a very key topic for you to look at. Documents and Incoterms, the methods of settlement, which I've briefly just touched on, and then some of the products get their own particular section. Collections, credits, guarantees and standby credits. Then we move on outside traditional trade finance into supply chain finance and other forms of finance. This then goes on to export credit and foreign exchange. And then a final chapter, the one which I hope you'll find the most interesting, to be honest, digital disruption and innovation. This has completely transformed our industry. It's fair to say that trade finance has, from a digital perspective, fallen behind many other types of finance, surely because it's very paper-based. And that, again, is what's caused many problems over the last 3 months during the pandemic. Every party involved in international trade is now looking at this. Digitalization is going to transform our industry in ways we can't even imagine. And much is happening at the moment. And the textbook provides a very good outline of what's going on in the world at the moment in digitalization. There is an assessment, and I apologize at the top left, the heading, it says CIFT, this is actually CITF. Excuse my bad typing. The assessment, the examination is actually multiple choice. It's based on the knowledge and application of that knowledge, and is 2 hours in duration. There are 100 multiple choice questions in 2 sections. Section A is 80 multiple choice questions, and section B is 4 case studies, each with 5 linked multiple choice questions. It's a very good exam. We review that exam twice a year. There are a few of us that review what goes on. We studied the answers that have been given in previous examinations. We make sure that the questions are still appropriate. So this examination is updated twice a year, and it's always appropriate for what you are doing. It's appropriate in the real world for how you approach international trade. So very quickly, that's it. I think I'll hand back to Alex for a moment. Let's see what he wants to talk about now.
Thanks, Dave. Thanks very much. That's great because gives us a lot of time for some Q&A. But first of all, please feel free to use the chat box to write. We've got some questions that have already come in, so that's great. But feel free to ask Dave or myself, but I'll probably defer to Dave for some questions. Give him a chance to catch a breather. But he mentioned that how the actual course works in the exam. I just thought you might be interested to see a sample exam question. We've got a couple. So Rox, is it possible you could put the first one up? And hopefully you were listening carefully to what Dave was saying, because he did cover this. So the question is, which of the following is not one of the main activities undertaken by the International Chamber of Commerce, the ICC? Is it dispute resolution, issuance of certificate of origin, policy advocacy, or rule setting? Good stuff. And we have over 220 people on the webinar at this very moment in time. More than that have joined. Oh, we're now at 221. Maybe people knew there was a quiz and wanted to join in. That's weird. A lot of participants joining. Maybe they heard there was a quiz. No, so it's good to see. So Dave, do you want to answer that one? I mean, you have told me the answer already, but just to let over to you.
Yeah, well, good to see that 86, 87% got it right. The issuance of certificates of origin is not.
So, have you ever been involved in a dispute resolution yourself with working with the ICC?
Yeah, I look after their DocDex dispute system. So we only get 4 or 5 inquiries a year on this. So it does cost money, unlike ICC rules which are out there. If you want a documentary dispute resolution, you do have to pay the ICC for this, but it's a fraction of the cost that a court would charge. So yeah, we do see quite a few.
Interesting cases all over the world come in, and it's interesting to see different disputes. But the ICC doing their job to help resolve those. We have another exam question. So Roxy's just preparing that. So for a contract to be legally binding, its terms should include. A lot of people very quick off the buzzer there. In Britain, normally we'd have like game show questions sort of in the sort of earlier afternoon for students, but a few people getting to do this early if they're in the UK. It starts their day. So yeah, so we have about 220 people on, so it's about half answered. We'll give them a couple more seconds. So Dave, do you want to answer that one for the benefit of people on the webinar?
Yeah, well, everybody's obviously very awake, and yeah, the vast majority have gone for A, which is the correct one. It is a good question there because it's the sort of question you would expect to see in an exam, because all of those answers are possible or feasible, you would think, if you were a layman and weren't aware of the subject. But if you've studied the subject, then you would know it has to be
exactly.
A. These are the type of questions we love, because if you haven't studied, you could guess any of those.
A warning to folk out there that think they can bluff the way through. You have to do the studying, and but the thing is, when you're getting the qualification, people know you've done the studying, and it shows a commitment to your career. And maybe some people I know do CITF because they're actually not in trade and they're looking to get into trade, and it shows a commitment to other people that they're interested in that whole matter.
Yes, that's a very good point, Alex. And I certainly in the last 2-3 years, I've heard of more and more people that aren't directly involved in trade and not even involved in banks getting involved in this examination. They want the CITF qualification because it gives them a really wide and good, sound understanding of the subject.
There's a couple of quick questions I can answer. John Brown is asking how much the CITF course costs. So it's £595. But and I do know that some banks pay for that for their people that are there, and in some countries there's also ways of getting various reductions in that. And so we've also, we've got Jenny too as asking any hints and tips for those taking the exam later in the year. I can help with a bit. The exam the CITF is on demand, so you can do it whenever. And we're also looking to have it being able to do it by remote invigilation, so that you could do it. Maybe you wouldn't have to go to a test center. You could maybe do it in an office or even at home. But I do know from speaking to some other people that you just have to be careful with managing your time. Do not get stuck. If you get stuck on a question, move on. Because I know from some people that they ran out of time because they stalled on one question. So I would say, do you know, Dave, any other tips, or is that a good one?
You've covered it very well. I mean, the key tip, of course, is to make sure you understand the textbook. It's there. It's got an awful lot of content in there. There are people providing independent training for these subjects that can be looked at, online training or textbooks again. speak to people in your own organisation that have taken the examination in the past. You may be the first, but you'll often find out you're not the first one. So find out what's happened before.
Yeah, that's the thing. Part of the reason why we're doing the webinars is to help give people information, because they're not sitting beside each other. People are very busy with their work, and what's tending to happen is that they're not like those kind of chats over a coffee. But we've got now a proper technical question for you here from me. So for USENS acceptance, usually drawee needs to sign bill of exchange for the acceptance. If the drawee didn't sign bill of exchange, however, change. So can you see that one, Dave, on the Q&A? So it's about USENS acceptance. Usually the drawee needs to sign a bill of exchange for the acceptance. If the drawee didn't sign bill of exchange, however, change it promissory note. Is this acceptable?
It's acceptable if all parties agree. This is actually quite an unusual circumstance, not something you'd see very often, because basically the type of financial document would be agreed in advance. So the correct one will be presented in it anyway. But if there is a need for it to be changed at some stage for a promissory note, yes, it's acceptable if all parties agree.
Okay. I just see some chat. Just so Dan, some people are asking about the test questions. We do have some on our system, and asking about having more examples. So I'll look into that when this is finished. Okay.
Can I have a quick comment on that, Alex? I mean, I actually agree with that comment. I think it would be very useful to have more test papers made available. It's not an easy thing. I mean, it's a lot of work to prepare these things. But yeah, and I know the updated course is only a year old, so there's not much background so far. But yeah, I think I do agree with that comment. It would be useful for practitioners and students to have access to a more wider range. Just so it's something for us to bear in mind.
And thank you for that feedback from people. There's also another question about Islamic banking, and a vast topic. I don't think there's anything. Is there anything? There isn't anything in CITF about Islamic banking, is there? Oh, sorry.
Yes, there is. When we prior to we had I would say back in 2016, 2017, we actually included an entire chapter on Islamic banking because it was obviously becoming more widely used and more people wanted to know about it. When we updated the course last year, we decided to not to use it as an entire chapter. We now include it in the other forms of finance chapter because it belongs with that. So yes, we do look at Islamic finance. It's very, very important, and it is rapidly growing throughout the world. So that's why it's there. And we were asked a question, and we had it from some people in Western countries saying, why is that there? We don't use it. And our answer is, at some stage you will come across it because some of your clients will use it.
Exactly. It's not only relevant to countries where you might think more like, say, maybe the Middle East, Indonesia, Malaysia. It's a global thing because we have customers that when I was at Santander that wanted to use the Islamic forms of finance. So it's relevant wherever you are in the world. And in terms of being a subject matter expert on international trade finance, you should have some knowledge of that. So, okay, there's one good question. Well, there's a lot of good questions, actually. There was one about the future. Let's see what it is. Oh, yes, here we go. According to certain circumstances, what is the future of documentary credits and letter of guarantee? That we get that question a lot, don't we? I've seen some. I spoke to the ICC last week, and they were saying that actually they're seeing an uptick because of the coronavirus. That there's an element of trust, but also companies folding. So, what's your view there, Dave?
It's a brilliant question. I would say for the since about 1990, the death of the documentary credit has been heralded.
That's when I joined banking, is it 1990?
And it's still there. How strange. And guess what? Your comment is right. Every time there is a problem, let's go to the financial crisis of 12 years ago, the pandemic now, all of a sudden people want to mitigate risk. And what do they use? They use the safe instruments such as documentary credits. So it's still there, and it's still a great risk mitigant. As to the future, it could be argued, well, in the future it's going to be all digital, so we no longer need the documentary credit. Yes, you do, because you still need to mitigate risk. But that's why the ICC have developed electronic rules for documentary credits, what's now known as the EUCP, which is in version 2. This now brings the documentary credit into the electronic world. Now, banks have been very, very slow in moving towards EUCP and using electronic documents. The last 3 months has started a catalyst and started kick-starting banks and organisations to start using electronic solutions. And the EUCP, for instance, will come into its own now. So what's the future? The future is still good because it's a great risk mitigant, and it has now developed itself to be suitable in an electronic world. Regarding letters of guarantee, the guarantee rules already allow for digital transactions, so they are already there. So yeah, what's the future? The future is they will still be used and will still be very, very important. But you may see them in a slightly different format. What I would say is that each of you, each of the banks here that issue documentary credits should take more care and attention to the structure of your documentary credit. There's a phrase, well, I won't use that phrase. Traditionally, many of banks have got the same structure to their documentary credit form as they've had for the last 50 years. And many companies ask for the same documents they've been asking for the last 20, 30, 40 years. You actually don't need to do that. You can make a documentary credit very, very simple, and you can have a documentary credit with very, very small number of documents. That's where you need to move forward in the future. That's how the documentary credit should evolve. And I know I've spoken to Alex separately about this. There is actually an ICC paper out there now which talks about a simple documentary credit format. And I urge you to look at the ICC website to find this. It will help you structure your LCs in the future in a far better way, especially when we move to digital.
And David, we've talked a bit about that, your work on a simple LC format. You know, we have a lot of people, you know, at least half the people out in the audience today are in the ops area. And, you know, I'm going to try and get you along. You're a very busy man, to try and get you along for a podcast to talk a bit further about that. But the essence of it is that the more simple you keep an LC format, the easier it is to manage something globally, and then keep it easier to make it, you know, for the future as trade picks up again. So this is really, you know, a time also on the digital side, but also keeping things simple, wouldn't you say?
Yeah, absolutely.
And that's the whole thing. You know, when we talk about when wars happen, that you know, technology advances, and you know, with the virus, that's helping the whole aspect of technological advances, and the ICC are focusing on that. So, in that respect, with our materials, we are keeping a close eye on anything, and we were updating as that happens. Somebody's asked a question if the course covers structured finance, like ABL financing.
Yeah, I mean, commodity finance, structured finance is in the textbook. Obviously, we don't go into too much depth because this is an introductory course to trade finance, but these sorts of financings are there and are touched upon.
And
yes.
Somebody's asked about the textbook, if it's sufficient to prepare for the exam. I think the answer is yes. I mean, you can actually, if you've got that textbook and you know it inside out, you will be able to pass the exam. But I would say that, you know, there is the qualification, but it's the broader aspect of your overall trade knowledge. And I would encourage people to, you know, attend various webinars, read up about it. You know, plenty of journals, you know, like from information from GTR, Trade Finance Global, TFX. Has become like a subject matter expert. I would say it's not just about the qualification, but, you know, reading around it. What would you say, Dave?
The textbook, as a standalone, you can pass the examination with that, no doubt whatsoever. But I think you want to do more than pass the examination. You want to understand more of the trade world. Exactly what Alex says. Do a wider reading. Look at the trade publications, go to the ICC websites, Chamber of Commerce websites, all sorts of websites. Look at the information that's out there. Yeah. Speak to your colleagues. The best training of all is on-the-job training, of course. But the problem with on-the-job training is that you're often narrowed down to a specific subject for quite a long time. The textbook takes you further than that. So yeah, you could pass the exam just by reading the textbook. I don't think that gives you the in-depth understanding of the subject that you really need if you're going to a practice.
Because the thing is, when you're doing the qualification, you know, you're out and about seeing, whether you might be in ops, you might be speaking to customers, you might be out and about in sales, speaking to customers, and then you can you'll be learning more things from them. You can speak to your people about it, tell them about what you're doing and how you're reading around the subject. So it's not just about the specific. Well, of course, that qualification is a good thing for you to help with your career, but I think it's a wider education piece. But still a good question. Thank you. Here's another good one here. Do you know if the ICC will update the URC in the near future? That's a good one, isn't it? All right, okay.
I know exactly. For those that aren't aware, URC is the Uniform Rules for Collections. They cover documentary collections. We have looked at this. We have not seen a business case that would justify the cost and expense of updating these rules. They still appear to be valid in their existing format. There appear to be very little gaps that are causing problems. Certainly, I mean, I receive all the queries for the ICC, from the technical advisory team. We rarely see a question on documentary collections, so it seems to be working. The fact is, if we do see a rationale, we do see a gap, then we will certainly update the URC. At this stage, no need.
And then that sort of led in somebody else to ask a question about UCP, of course. Kind of the two things are linked, and obviously there are a few questions about that recently with the COVID virus. What's your view on that?
Yeah, well, we actually did an in-depth study of this 3 years ago and made a presentation at the ICC Banking Commission meeting in April 2017 in Jakarta. And we spoke to all national committees, we spoke to parties involved, and we tried to find the gaps. And we found very little problematical gaps in the UCP itself, in the rules. What we found, the problems that are arising, 95 to 98% of them are in practice. It's not the rules. The rules are fine. The problem is that there are different practices all around the world. And this is one of the reasons why the International Chamber of Commerce produced the ISBP, which some of you will be aware of, International Standard Banking Practice, for the examination of documents under documentary credits. This is the publication that's not well known for various reasons. I won't go into the ins and outs of them now, but it is there. In summary, are we planning to update the UCP at the moment? It's forever on our minds, but we haven't yet seen the business case because we believe it's not the rules that are the problem, it's the practices.
There's some questions about CDCS, which kind of leads nicely into the fact that this time next week we'll have somebody also well-known, Gary Collier, talking about CDCS, another webinar. And I'd like to remind people that we will also be passing out a recording of this. What I like about today is we had a lot more time for Q&A, so we've been able to deal with most of the things. Somebody's asking about whether we'll see an electronic version of URD 758 like EUCP.
That's an excellent question. When we, a year or a couple of years back now, looked at which ICC rules needed to be brought into the digital world, the obvious one was UCP. So we put the EUCP and we did the EURC with it. We looked very closely at URDG 758, and our belief and understanding, and it's still the same, is that URDG 758 is already in the digital world. It already allows for electronic records. It already allows for data presentation. So no, we won't produce an electronic version because we think it already covers the digital world. It's already there. If someone can come up and tell us there is a gap, please do approach us. Please let the ICC or your national committee know. But at the moment, it's already there.
This is interesting. Another question, will URBPO be joined with URC to avoid physical documents?
Okay, the URBPO, the Uniform Rules for Bank Payment Obligations, which came into place 2-3 years back, not many of you have used them. They don't really link with the URC. They're a separate set of rules, but they were in place to look at electronic transactions for electronic obligations. These rules were also examined again last year to see if we could bring them up to date. The problem with the URBPO is that they are bank to bank. They do not include the buyer and seller. So we decided, could we bring it in as a four-corner model, buyer, seller, bank and bank? And it didn't seem a worthwhile exercise to do. We decided the best way to approach this was to produce a brand new set of rules that encompasses all types of electronic transactions and these are now called the Uniform Rules for Digital Trade Transactions. We are now in draft 3. They're not produced yet. Draft 3 was only this week, so it will be next week. Will be sent out to ICC national committees, and we will hope to have these rules finalised by the end of the year. So there won't be a new URBPO. We think there's a better set of rules coming out which will cover all digital trade transactions. You will see them quite soon. If you are in an ICC national committee, you would already have seen certain drafts of these.
I think in the interest of time, we'll just do one last question, but I'm hoping it can this means something to you. So I think it might be from Vietnam. It says UPAS LC, UPAS LC. Does that mean something to you?
Yeah, the UPAS LC is quite common in that part of the world.
What does it stand for?
So it's a use and
payment at
sites.
I do know that one. We should have got. We always do like to abbreviate everything. Yes, I have heard that one. So it's good. So UPAS LC is good for both buyer and seller, but technically, could I have your expert advice? Is it import finance or export finance?
It's finance. It's trade finance. I'm not going to restrict it to import or export. It helps finance international trade. UPAS LCs are very useful in the countries in which they're being used, and they could be used more widely. If people find that this type of tool is useful, then they would use them. But I wouldn't call it import or export. It's international trade.
And she's asking about using for domestic LC, using local currency, and it happens there. But you know, if it works, it happens. Yeah,
can be done. If you find it to be a useful tool that mitigates the risks that you have and can be used operationally correctly in your country, no objections. But do ensure that such LCs are still covered by the UCP 600.
There's a couple of. We'll answer the ones that come. There's just one interesting question that. Well, this will be the last one. The trouble is, there's more coming in, but we'll answer the other ones offline in a note that we'll send out to everybody. But there's a good question. When do you think blockchain issuances will cover more than 10% of overall? I mean, this is an interesting question because it's not even 1%, is it? I mean, and it's been the panacea. But what's your views on this, Dave?
It's not even 0.1%. If I knew the answer to this, I could make a fortune. I can't give you a period of time. What I can tell you is that it may not be blockchain, by the way. It may be some other kind of digital ledger technology, DLC. But we will see at one stage, unknown in the future, the majority of credits will probably be based upon such type of technology. DLT, blockchain, and smart contracts. Letter of credit is already a smart contract, by the way. The idea of a smart contract is something. If something comes in, something will go out. If something one event happens, another event will happen. But that's what you do in the paper world with documentary credits already. If you present documents and they're compliant, you get your money. So, but yeah, when will it be? I don't know. But all I can assure you is that keep an eye on this space. Digitalization is going to transform the traditional trade world, and it will become the predominant form of financing at a unknown time in the future. The fact that we've had this pandemic has probably catalyzed this, kickstarted it. What's happened in the last 3 months would normally take 3 years. So expect it to happen quicker than we had first thought.
I think that's a good point to end on. I mean, the fact is that all that technology, there could be things that are being developed that we don't even know about yet that will be the future. But the overall thing, no matter whether you're using blockchain or whatever, the LC as a format is still, you know, it hasn't changed much over the years because some of the rules have adapted, but, you know, the concept of international trade is very much there. Dave, thanks ever so much for your time today. Thanks to everybody for joining from all around the world, over 220 people. So thanks ever so much. We'll see you hopefully next week for Gary Collier talking about documentary credits. And just like to say goodbye to everybody. Thank you.